This is the journey to one Africa.
The war in Sudan is an interesting war. Interesting in the sense that the Sudan we see today is a Sudan after the departure of South Sudan. And let me remind all of us that before the year 2011, the former leader of South Sudan, John Garang Dimabior, said, "Let us not split, because when we split, even Sudan, governed from Khartoum, will not be safe. There'll be other conflicts." And what he said is what is happening now. You remember the two combatants now, or the two leaders, Burhan and Hemeti, fought from the same side. And the Rapid Support Force, which is now headed by Hemeti, and the army, which is now headed by Burhan, were on the same side with Omar el-Bashir. And after Omar el-Bashir was overthrown, you had the civilian administration supported by the army led by Prime Minister Hamdok. Now, you can see that this is a war about power and control. It is a war that has come out as a result of the conflict in that region. Remember that the Hemeti group, which RSF, is supported quite actively by General Haftar from Libya. And remember that General Burhan, which is the Sudanese army, is now indeed supported by the Egyptian government. So one could say that it is progressively becoming a proxy war, which started as a war of egos. Who will control Sudan? And what has then happened is you now have an army which is on the run, and you have an army by RSF which has put together a number of mercenaries. It is now known that many who are fighting on the side of Hemeti come from Niger, from Chad, from the Sahel, from Libya. So the confusion is grave and profound. And it is a war that really, if not looked at and stopped in good time, would degenerate into a civil war. Why do I say that? I say that because within Sudan, there are forces that have always wanted to either separate or to be governed differently, different from the way the government in Khartoum is governing. Darfur is one of them. Abyei is another area. The Blue Nile is another area. The Nuba Mountains is another area. And there are those who have always argued that the philosophy of the Sudanese administration is to Arabize Sudan. And they say this, it started with Al-Turabi, and it was manifested through the Janjaweed, and they think that both Burhan and Hemeti are actually purveyors of pan-Arabism and Arabization of Sudan. So in as much as they are fighting each other, from some quarters, they are seen to be ideological twins. So it is a complex war, the war in Sudan. now referred to as the forgotten war. Forgotten because major news or media houses no longer talk about it, yet it has generated refugees in the millions. The unfortunate and forgotten war, the war in Sudan. You know, because this is an African war, and there is a sense in which events in Africa are sometimes very peripheral to the international media houses. And for that reason, if you look at many media houses, whether they are the big Western media houses like Deutsche Welle or Western medias, or particularly Deutsche Welle, CNN, or the BBC, or Radio or France TV, or any one of them, they don't talk about it because from where they sit, it is not a country that has a lot of strategic significance for them. And the African media houses do not have the capacity to really have people on the ground. They don't have the financial capacity. They don't have capacity to actually report these things in the manner that they ought to be reported. The net effect is that if you ask 1 out of 10 people in any country in Africa, they don't know what is happening in Sudan. And we know as a fact that there are refugees in Chad, refugees in Ethiopia, refugees in South Sudan, refugees in Egypt, refugees in Libya to the extent that they are not expelled. And the humanitarian situation there is dire. It is dire because even the support system from multilateral organizations such as the UN is very minimal. The African Union is silent. There have been attempts, as you and me know, by IGAD to mediate a solution to that problem, but that also has not taken anybody any distance. And this is something that must concern all persons, and particularly Africans of goodwill, that you have a major conflict of this kind. And this kind of conflict has not animated the African heads of states and government to convene an urgent meeting of heads of states and government to discuss how to resolve the issue. I'm aware that IGAD has tried to do something, but IGAD should not be operating without reference to the African Union. And that tells you how weak the situation is with African organizations. The only attempt at peacemaking, which one would have said has tried to do something, is once again an American mediated process which took place in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. But even that did not go very far. And the net effect, as I've said, is that the war is almost forgotten, and the attitude is almost let them fight themselves until they resolve the problem either by way of surrender of the other or by way of defeat of the other. A very unfortunate situation. Kenya was supposed to lead the peace process under IGAD, but very quickly the president of Sudan, Major General Burhan, said that Kenya was not an independent arbiter. And you know that General Hemeti of RSF did visit Kenya and met the Kenyan president, and as a result of that, the ambassador of Sudan was recalled back to Khartoum. So Kenya is not once again in this conflict being seen as an independent arbiter. And this is what I think is the problem, that the tendency by individual African countries to take steps in matters as complex as these without consultation is dangerous from a diplomatic standpoint, because it then undermines the diplomatic power of such countries. And my view, once again, is that when you want to resolve regional conflict, it is always wise to use the avenue that is provided by regional organization. We know that Sudan is a member of IGAD, so you can start with IGAD and therefore operate within IGAD. We know that Sudan is a member of the African Union if you want to do it continentally, and then do it in that manner. But if you want to be unilateral, as if you are one of the major powers, the net effect is that you'll find yourself being excluded and being considered as a pariah nation. And that is not good for any country, that when you move forward to offer solutions, you are seen to have taken side in matters which are very complex, because matters of this nature are very complex, and it is important to treat with care and with caution and to consult very widely and to ensure that you give due regard to governments which are internationally recognized. If you don't do so, then you burn your fingers and burn them very badly. Within the continent of Africa, the impact of the war in Sudan is major. Look at Egypt. Egypt has had to bear the brunt of refugees. And when you talk about refugees, then you are talking about humanitarian situation in that particular area. And Egypt actually has stopped some of the refugees from crossing into their territory. Look at Chad, which has had her own problems. The humanitarian situation in that part of the world is terrible. And we now know that it is going to be for a long time, because young children who ought to have been immunized against diseases such as polio and measles will not be immunized for the next many years. Ethiopia, which has had problems, also is bearing the brunt of this. Libya is bearing the brunt of this. South Sudan, which has our own problems, is bearing the brunt of this. And remember that when there is a war, there is no economic activity. And when there is no economic activity, it means there is no production. You will have read that when the bombardment was taking place in Khartoum and in the twin city of Omdurman, and people went to Port Sudan, then what happened is that there was a major humanitarian situation there, almost a plague of flies because of the sewage situation in that area. Port Sudan is a very important port for South Sudan for purposes of exportation of their oil. That is disrupted. So the impact from a humanitarian perspective, the impact from an economic perspective is huge. Remember, Sudan, in terms of sheer territory, is one of the largest countries in the continent of Africa, and that is not good. So we are going to see the impact of that war not only now, but for a long time to come. There is no agriculture going on in that country. And if there is no agriculture, it means that there will be a food shortage. And the world is now facing very, very, very many difficult circumstances with the ongoing wars. We know the war in Ukraine, which the area that produces grain is problematic in terms of food production. And we have already talked about other wars. So the war in Sudan is devastating, but is not receiving the kind of attention that we would want it to receive. The argument which I've had put forth by the Sudan army led by General Burhan that they are going to have a military victory is without merit. The situation on the ground tells a different story. It tells you that there is a stalemate of sorts. It tells you that there is now indiscriminate bombing. It tells you that the original reason, if there was indeed a reason why the war commenced at all, has been lost. There is now war for war's sake. It tells you that it is egos that are standing in the way of resolution and therefore occasioning human suffering. If that war is not stopped, it is going to animate other interests and may degenerate into a civil war, which will involve combatants from places such as Darfur, places such as Abyei, places such as the Nuba Mountains. And when you start a civil war which has many heads, Hydra-headed, it could go on for a long time. So what is the way forward? Easier said than done. But I believe that it is important for the African continent and the institutions of African Union to come forth and begin to do something about it. I personally do know some retired African heads of states, and in formal settings we have said and told them it is the duty of the eminent African former heads of state to come into the arena. We have people like Olusegun Obasanjo. We have people like Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete. We have people like Joachim Chissano. We have individuals, people like Thabo Mbeki, who in my view should now come forth and lead this process under the auspices of the African Union. The African Union is too lethargic. And the idea that we'll rely on Saudi Arabia or the United States of America to resolve this war is without merit. The Americans are now preoccupied with the war in Gaza, and they have little regard or little concern for what is happening in Sudan, because strategically the Middle East is much more important for them. So African Union, through eminent persons, this is one of the ways in which this dispute can be addressed and hopefully resolved. And time is of the essence. Time is of the essence. And we are having this conversation when there is a meeting of the non-aligned movement in Kampala, Uganda. And I hope that conflicts in Africa is going to be one of the agenda items, and how to resolve them. And if that is what is going to happen, then let us hope that it will happen sooner rather than later. You know, when we talk about war and peace, we must recognize that there are those who love war because war has economic benefits. All of us claim we love peace because peace allows political development, economic development, social cohesion, and is the desirable thing for all human beings. But in international relations, when people engage in peace negotiations, it is true that they want to know, after we have midwifed and brokered peace, what is in it for us? And what is in it, particularly when you have major nations involved, they are going to look at the natural resources. And it is already, in fact, known that in Sudan there are gold deposits, there are deposits which are of interest to international players. It is known that there is oil, it is known that these are major sea routes, it is known that there are countries that would want to have their military bases in those areas. And that is why the desirable position always, when there is conflict, particularly in Africa, we must ensure or try to ensure that the solutions are African solutions. That does not mean that we eliminate friends of goodwill. We are not living in isolation from the world. The AU can always receive technical or other support from different parts of the world. And different parts of the world can mean India, can mean China, can mean Russia, can mean the the European Union, and indeed any part of the world. If they do that, but on the understanding that we are resolving this particular conflict because it is good not only for Africa, but it is also good for the world. Look at it now. In the year 2021, African Union said that we were going to have the silencing of the guns. Why did we want to silence the guns? We wanted to silence the guns because peace is necessary for trade. And Africa Agenda 2063 and Africa Continental Free Trade Area contemplates a situation where Sudan will be trading with South Sudan and every other country in the world. But today, how do you move goods from Sudan to South Sudan, to Chad, to Ethiopia, to Egypt, to Libya, if there is conflict? So the most important thing is that the dividends of peace must be marketed to all. A peaceful Sudan is good for Egypt. A peaceful Sudan is good for Chad. A peaceful Sudan is good for Libya. A peaceful Sudan is good for Ethiopia. A peaceful Sudan is good for South Sudan. A peaceful Sudan is good for Africa. A peaceful Sudan is good for the world, because it will then allow for trade and allow for things that will ensure that the world is the happier and the better economically and otherwise.
Hey guys, as you're watching this video, our vision is to reach 500,000 subscribers. Hit the subscribe button, join membership to support our channel, join Patreon and PayPal. All the links are in the description. Do that to stand with us for this beautiful cause of One Africa right now. We do not forget to sign up for the petition. The link is down below. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.